East Africa, from the northern parts to the central areas of Kilwa, as seen in these videos, and down to the south, is a very interesting area of study. Now, if we focus first on Kilwa, what we can see is that there was a general and a acceptance of excellence in this region. We don't need to, but I could show an image of it. But people like Ibn Battuta mentioned that the majority of this population were jet black. Now, does that mean anything to anybody? Well, to me, it means a lot, and I'll tell you why. Because all the surrounding cities around this area, whether they were Muslim, Christian, or non Muslim, had a similar lifestyle to those people. And I think the one I should start with is Somalia. We should start with Mogadishu. And of course, some of you are going to say, why? Well, the reason is because Mogadishu is one of those places where we have historical records talking about people from Mogadishu going as far as Korea, because Muslims traveled as far as Korea. And using that type of knowledge, we know that in isolated incidences, they made it all the way to Japan. If you understand what I'm saying, I'm telling you that the Muslims of East Africa traveled in the ninth century. Hear what I'm saying? In the ninth century, they traveled to Korea, and there's written record both in Korea and in Muslim records. Now, Mogadishu was found in the 10th century, but it was not a vacant spot before the city was named Mogadishu and basically altered to become as successful as it became. So, what we have to talk about is three people. Right now, I'm going to talk about three people, and I'm going to show you written records that show these three people are called Mogadishu. Mogadishu is the real word of Mogadishu, well, the Arabic word of Mogadishu. And they show that one of them, who's a jurist, is in China. Remember how old this is. We're not talking about 1700s, we're not talking about 1600s. We're talking about 1100s to about the 1300s. One of them is in China. One of them is off of an island near India, and the other one is somewhere in Africa, but is shown to play a giant role in transporting people around the world. Why is that important? Well, the reason why that's important is because after that we have all these other islands like Madagascar, and we start seeing other people from those islands as well doing the same thing, meaning that East Africa in general, probably more than other places in the world, is more fascinating in its abilities at the time. It didn't matter what religion they worshipped. A lot of them were pagan. A lot of them were not Muslim at all, who lived both in Mogadishu, Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, Great Zimbabwe, and more. Yet they pushed for advancement, because some people don't understand that the Bantu religions were competing and holding their ground against modern religions at the time. Mogadishu, which is a town of enormous size, its inhabitants are merchants possessed of vast resources. They own large numbers of camels, of which they slaughter hundreds every day for food, and also have quantities of sheep. In this place are manufactured the woven fabrics called after it, which are unequaled and exported from it to Egypt and elsewhere. It is custom of the people of this town that when a vessel reaches the anchorage, the sambuks, which are small boats, come out to it in each sambuk there are a number of young men of the town, each one of whom brings a covered platter containing food and presents it to one of the other merchants on the ship, saying, "This is my guest," and each of the others does the same. The merchants, on disembarking, goes only to the town house of his host among the young men, except those of them who have made frequent journeys to the towns and have gained some acquaintance with its inhabitants. These lodge where they please. When he takes up residence with his host, the latter sells his goods for him and buys for him, and if anyone buys anything from him at too low a price or sells to him in the absence of his host, that sale is held invalid by them. This practice is a profitable one for them. So that's just a small description by Ibn Battuta, 1300s, of Mogadishu, and you can see that's a very organized place. It's not just a place that exists where you're like, oh, it's the houses are loosely resemble civilization or whatever. We're talking about a large infrastructure, a large settlement that is really the envy of the world for a lot of Arabs. And in fact, a lot of Arabs wanted it to be part of their domain, part of their steads. Before we move on to Kilwa and how they were mentioned, let's first mention the three people from Mogadishu. I just wanted to show you that that word is exactly the same as Mogadishu, that these people are explained in this. So it says here, I met in this mosque a pious jurist from Mogadishu called Saeed, of fine figure and character. He used to fast continually, and I was told that he studied at Mecca for 14 years, and for the same length of time at Al Madinah had met Abu Namir and Amir of Mecca and Mansur Jamaz, the Amir of Al Madinah, and had traveled in India and China. Before I read the next one, I want to direct your attention to the map at the side. You can see there it's written the Maldives. So, like I said, we're going to look at a different Mogadishu, person from Mogadishu, and I want you to look at that place written Maldives. You see that it's closer to India than it is to Africa. So, we're going to read right now. This is a reading from Ibn Battuta. I opened the Quran and found the angels will descend to them, saying, "Do not be afraid and do not grieve." I asked God's blessing and set out. After 10 days, I reached the Maldive Islands and landed in Canalus. Its governor, Abd al Aziz of Mogadishu, treated me with honor, offered me hospitality, and prepared a kandura for me. After I reached Hululi, which is the island to which the Sultana and her sisters go to relax and swim. So you can see here the second one, and this is why I'm telling you that Mogadishu was just at this time related 100% to places like India and China. It was an easy move for them to go there. We have two people. One went to China just to visit. The other one is a sultan, but he was of Mogadishu, but he was a sultan of the Maldives, which are close to Sri Lanka, Ceylon, which is what Sri Lanka used to be called. So this is the difference, right? Africa used to just travel to China and all these places. And like I said before, the Portuguese, when they traveled to Japan, they enlisted the help of the East Africans because the East Africans understood the winds and the oceans at the time, because they had traveled back and forth, and you could take 3 years to go to India if you go in the wrong season, meaning that the winds are going to blow you back and back and back. And then when you finally get there, you're like, what the hell? Meanwhile, in other cases, it could take you, I don't know, a couple weeks, couple days if you go at the right time and let the winds push you there. Now, that's all fine and dandy, but how far back does this go? Well, in order to find this out, we have to go to Al Masudi. This is trying to draw this similarity or this connection between India, China, and the Abyssinians or Mogadishu. Like I said, Mogadishu was founded in the 10th century, but before this, there was still um, Abyssinia, who go back a couple thousands of years, which you can see is written about by Al Masudi, who writes, estimates have been made respecting the extent of the Indian Sea, which is identical with the Abyssinian Sea. Its length from the most western part of Abyssinia as far as China in the east is 8,000 miles, and its breadth is in one place 2,700, and in another 1,900 miles, for it varies in different places. These dimensions have been disputed, but we will not enter into the different statements, because there are no proofs upon which they rest. This is the greatest sea of the habitable world. It has a gulf extending from Abyssinia as far as the Barbaria, a country situated between the territory of the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This gulf is called the Barbarian Gulf. It is 500 miles long, and at the beginning and end 100 miles wide. These are not the Berbers who live west of Africa, for that is a different country altogether. It has the same name, although it has the same name. The sailors of Oman go on this sea as far as the island of Kanbalu, in the sea of the Zanj. This island is inhabited by Muslims and by Zanj, who have not embraced the Islam. The sailors of Oman, to whom we have just alluded, believe that this gulf, which is called the Barbarian Gulf, and with them the Sea of the Berbers, and of the country of Jofuni, is much greater than we have said. The waves of the sea are huge, like high mountains. Okay, so we don't need to read really any further, but I will. Anyone who's not interested can skip, but I think we should read this whole thing. These are blind waves. This term means waves which rise as high as mountains and between which abysses open like the deepest valleys, but they do not break. Hence, no foam is created like that produced by the collision of the waves in the other seas. They believe that these waves are enchanted. The sailors of Oman who sail on this sea are Arabs of the tribe of El Azd, and when they are on the board a ship, sometimes lifted up by these waves, and then again sinking between them, they say verses whilst they are at work, as O Barbaria and Jofuni, and thy enchanted waves, Jofuni and Barbaria, and their waves, as thou seest them. These sailors go on the sea of Ezanj as far as the island of Kanbalu and Sofala of the Demdema, which is on the extremity. Now, I want to be clear about this. This is another connection between the extremities because Oman is very far away from Africa, but close to India again. Still sticking to Al Masudi, we continue as we see him talk about these people in more detail, and you'll notice how by this time we already are seeing the connection between India and all these other places, which, by the way, was mentioned in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. We're talking about a couple hundreds of years back before this moment. So this isn't even the earliest. This is just showing you these specific kingdoms. Okay, so let's just start here. It proceeds flowing through that part of the country of Sudan which borders on the country of the Zanj, and a branch goes off it into the Sea of the Zanj. This is the sea of the island Kanbalu, which is cultivated, and the inhabitants are Muslims, but they speak the Zanji language. The Mohammedans have conquered this island and made the inhabitants prisoners, just as they have taken the Isle of Crete. So you see here, they're talking about a native population that converted to Islam, and they still speak a Zanji language. They don't speak Arabic, and they basically have converted the people of this island into Muslims. But you could tell with other things, this place was already sophisticated before they got there. It's just now with the introduction of Islam, it goes in an Islamic bend. The comparison with Crete is not a small one because, of course, the same thing happened to Crete, even though Crete has a civilization that goes back a couple thousand years. And of course, the inhabitants of Crete are mixed. But let's first come back to a certain point. Everything I've mentioned so far has nothing to do with Portuguese. The Portuguese haven't landed in these areas yet. Everything I'm talking about is two groups that are in this region. One, the black native Africans, and two, the foreign Arabs, and they're a minority. Well, how do I know? Well, we can read it from Ibn Battuta. A couple of things to keep in mind while reading this is even in the time of Al Masudi, the 900s, you could tell that the majority of the population was still Zanj and they were speaking Zanji languages. And now we're going to read from Ibn Battuta, which is from the 1300s. And so we see here, if one intends to make an ablution, he holds a vessel between his thighs and pours on his hands and performs the ritual washing. All the people walk with bare feet. We stayed one night in this island and sailed on to the city of Kulwa, a large city on the seacoast, most of whose inhabitants are Zinj, jet black in color. They have tattoo marks on their faces, just as there are on the faces of the, which is not important, but it basically tells you that. So we go from Mogadishu to another island. He's probably speaking about Kanbula, but with a different name, and then to Kulwa or Kilwa, and he talks about how the people of Kilwa are jet black, the majority. But remember, Kilwa was not settled during Ibn Battuta's time. It happened before that, even before um, Masudi, who is hundreds of years before Ibn Battuta. So this is a long held area, and the population did not change for hundreds of years. And even today, I mean, still black people. And estimates say there was 11,000 people living on this island. So let's just read the whole thing quickly. I then sailed from the city of Mogadishu, that was the main point, making for the country of the Swahilis, with the object of visiting the city of Kulwa in the land of the Zinj people. We came to the island of Mombasa, a large island 2 days' journey of the Sea of Swahili country. It has no mainland territory, and its trees are the banana, the lemon, the citron. Its people have a fruit which they call jamun, resembling an olive, and with a stone like its stone. The inhabitants of this island sow no grain, and it has to be transported to them from the Swahili. Their food consists mostly of bananas and fish. They are Shafits in right, pious, honorable, and upright, and their mosques are made of wood, admirably constructed at each of the gates of the mosques. There are one or two wells, and they draw up water from them in a wooden vessel into which has been fixed a thin stick of length of 1 cubit. The ground round the well and the mosque is paved. Anyone who intends to go into the mosque washes his feet, and then we get back to where I started. But this is Kilwa, this is the coast. And remember, this coast is still connected to India, China, ultimately Korea. Abu Ishaq Ibrahim ibn Muhammad al Farisi al Istakri was a person who was a map maker and a writer of history, and he wrote a couple books about different cities around the world, including some of the ones that we've already talked about. But he is the oldest person to write about Korea, meaning that we know that Korea was connected with the Muslim world. And not only that, we know that there were several Muslims in Korea who were living at the time. And the funny part is, we have Eastern documents of this, meaning we have documents in Korea of this as well. But first, let's read UNESCO. This is from UNESCO. Of 20 writings by 11 Muslim scholars of the medieval age concerning Silla, 10 sources by 9 scholars, Ibn Kardabin, Masudi, and others, contain records of advance of Muslims onto the Korean peninsula and their activities, the oldest extant record being not only the first remark on the Korean peninsula, but also a mention of a settlement of Muslims on the Korean peninsula, is Ibn Kurdaba's General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms. The book, seemingly with the first edition in 846 to 847, and the second edition in 885 respectively, was something like an official guide book of geography, being the oldest bibliographical source in geography extant today. The book contains detailed information about major places of settlement, trading routes, and trading goods in many parts of the world. It also contains comprehensive knowledge about East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and the like. Two passages about the advance made by Muslims to the Korean peninsula and their settlement are as follows, though their contents are somewhat similar to one another. Beyond China, across from Kansu, there is a country with many mountains called Silla. It abounds in gold. Muslims who happen to go there were fascinated by the good environment and tend to settle there for good. There is no way of knowing what lies beyond there. Beyond China, there is a country abounding in gold called Silla. Muslims who advance there, captivated by its congenial surroundings, tend to settle there for good and do not think of leaving the place. The second Muslim scholar who mentioned the settlement of the Muslims in Korea after Ibn Qurdaba was Ibn Rushda in Catalogue of Precious Goods. He wrote with little explanation that beyond China there is a country called Silla which abounds in gold, and that Muslims once settled there do not think of leaving. His expressions is similar to Ibn Qurdaba General Survey of Roads and Kingdoms concerning Silla, like Yaqubi ibn al-Faqih, Kadama, Jahiz, Yad Hajan, and the like. Ibn Rushda seem to have been very much influenced by the writings of Ibn Qurdabin. There are more detailed and factual accounts on Muslims living in Silla in two writings by Masudi, The Golden Step, and Gem Mines. and Learnings and General Survey, published 1 century later, following General Survey of Reading and Kingdoms, Masudi identified the Muslims living in Silla, and according to him, some of them were Iraqis. Across the coast of China, not much is known except for Silla and its accompanying islands. Iraqis and some other foreigners settled there, choosing the place as their homeland. They do not intend to leave the place because of its fresh air, clean water, fertile earth, prospect for the increase of profit and income, rich minerals, and rich gems. Those who leave the place are quite few. So that's from UNESCO. For those of you who are paying attention, you would have seen that there was a mention of Al Masudi. Now, the reason I didn't bring him up first was because he's not the earliest to write about this area, but he does mention it. And we can read here, because of course they said Silla was the name of Korea. And we will read here. There are wonderful accounts reported respecting the Sea of China and those which are in connection with it. We refer the reader to our books on these subjects, which we have frequently had occasion to bring under his notice. Beyond the coast of China is no other kingdom known or described excepting the country of Es-Sabal, Japan, and Es-Silla, Korea, and the islands which belong to it. No one from Iraq or any other place of the West frequents this country. The air of this country is wholesome, the water good, the soil fertile, and the precious stones are brilliant and genuine. Hence the country is rich, and it seldom happens that the inhabitants leave their native soil. They are allies of the Chinese, and the kings of both countries constantly exchange presents. So you'll notice there, it's not a slight understanding of Korea. This is a very deep understanding of Korea. And of course, like I showed you, Al Masudi, Ibn Battuta, and many others say that one of the, so on one side, the friendliest people of China are the Koreans, and then on the other side, another trade partner are the Sudan, basically the Zanj and the Abyssinians. This makes it the center of both of these places in terms of trade. And you will see writings about wood and stuff being transported and all the stupid stuff. But that's not important right now. One thing they do mention, though, is the difference between the boats that existed at the time, because Abyssinian boats and Zanj boats, a lot of the time, were built without nails because of corrosion. And, it was different for these other places. But this is the conclusion here. This early, they knew about Japan and, in fact, went to Japan. Isolated incidences, it didn't make a big difference in the history of Japan, but they did go there. But something to keep in mind, which is very important, is that these writings are before Genghis Khan was even born. So these connections are not made because of the Mongols. In fact, the Mongols had never ventured beyond their areas, still being pushed back by the Chinese. And, obviously they went into China sometimes, they broke in, but there were still just these tribes in those areas. The Muslims had penetrated far into Japan and Korea. And remember, just like we see giraffes in China, pictures, paintings of giraffes in China, and of course, exploration that would later happen by Zheng He. But remember, Zheng He is still later. He's not necessarily an example of the people who inspired the Abyssinians and the Zanj to go and trade with China. And so this is something they thought of themselves. So this is why it's not a surprise that by the time of the kingdom of Mozambique, and remember Mozambique, I'm not talking about the Portuguese side of it, by the time of the kingdoms of Sena, the kingdom of Kilwa, the kingdom of Manigena, the kingdom of all these places that are Bantu regions, we find these Chinese pottery in this place. But this connection, though the Muslims write about it in the 900s, is actually earlier. Now, why would I say that? Well, it's because, they've dated the dates of some of these pottery, Chinese made pottery, that this is not a version of what would have been there, but they have it and it's in writing, and it's from the 7th century in Mozambique. Now, assumptions before first thought that it must have traveled from China to India to the Middle East, from Egypt to Mogadishu, from Mogadishu to the Swahili coast, from the Swahili coast to Mozambique. That's not what happened. It's easier today to believe that it went from China to the Zanj regions, including Mozambique directly, as that would be one of their trade partners. Unfortunately, because Mozambique at the time, in the 7th century, did not have any writing, it means that we will never fully understand what they saw. Who gave them these items? Was it literally these pale skinned Chinese people getting off of boats and trading with them? And for what exactly? I mean, we do know because we have it in Chinese records, but we don't know from the point of view of the people of Mozambique. You know, China tends to generalize East Africa. They don't tend to separate. But we do know that the word Zanj appears in Chinese records over and over again, meaning that they did deal directly with the Zanj when it came to trade. Remember, the word Zanj is just another word for Bantu people, but it's not all Bantu people. It's the Bantu people living in East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Zambia, those regions. It's hard to know what the original people thought about what they saw, but later fragments would continue to come in, even into the later centuries. And so we read the later fragments of the Chinese. So it says here the minority categories of Chinese porcelain shards recovered can be placed in the early Qing period dating to the 17th and 18th century CE, and the late Qing period, 18th and 20th century CE, in the same archaeological context of Convent Sao Dimago. Was also found a variety of European tin glazed earthenware, such as blue on white and blue and green on gray, with a variety of decorative motifs, and blue or green transfer printed whiteware. The chronological and geographical distribution of the Chinese and European ceramics on Mozambique Island present key patterns within regional trade history. In the early phase of this trade, the 15th and 16th century, the most dominant ceramics seem to be Chinese porcelains and are commonly associated with the global Sino-Swahili trade network. In the later period, the importation of European ceramics become more common, also involved the export of ivory, enslaved people, gold, timbers, pearls, seed pearls, ambergris, tortoise shells, animal skins, and local potteries to Portugal and other Western European countries and their Northern American colonies, which I think is a very important thing to talk about, to remember that before that, before the Europeans arrive, You don't see any ceramics from Europe. Zilch, zero. And then they arrive, you start to see them replace the Chinese ones, meaning that, as they write, it was a global Sino Swahili trade network. Very important. While paintings that depict Chinese people holding giraffes with these long necks and everything, and you can see that they have full contact with these animals. So this is not speculation. They actually traded them. While this is fascinating in proving it, this is not the best thing they got from Africa. Africans had gold at the time, so they traded gold with the Africans for ceramics and other things. And of course, the animals were crazy to them. Like, how is this possible that there's animals that look like this that you do not find in China? So, in conclusion, I actually want you in your head to imagine the scenario. And I think this perfect drawing, who I don't know who made it, but it's from the internet, will depict what type of world there was. You can see in the corner, there's an Arab man staring at this African man who's holding a giraffe, and then there's obviously a king from China standing behind. And this is a perfect image because it tells you and it shows you how different the cultures, but when they come together, how, I don't know, awesome it might have looked in the heads of many. And we know this happened. This scenario, even though it's a modern painting, we know it absolutely happened because Ibn Battuta writes about it. Ibn Battuta writes about Africans who are literally in China while there are Muslims there, while there are, what you call that, while there are Chinese people, obviously, because they're native to China, in China. So, and by the way, this is before the Portuguese ever were involved in any of this. No Europe, none of that, just straightforward. Now, I'm not saying there are no Muslim Europeans who traveled early. That did happen. I'm just saying it wasn't Europe proper. It wasn't colonizing Europe that took over Africa and all of that. This is prior to all of that. The world, it didn't seem obvious what direction the world was going. And I wish there was a painting of this type where it showed all the cultures in one region. Except there is, obviously, with that Chinese one that I showed you, where the Chinese one shows Western empires. But that's not important for this video.